And this morning, President Trump is launching new attacks on Fed Chair Jerome Powell, writing on Truth Social, quote, "He is truly one of my worst appointments." His criticism has been growing louder. We reported this week the president actually broached the idea of firing Powell with GOP lawmakers, although he later said it was highly unlikely. But the president continues to call for lower interest rates, writing in another post, quote, "Lower the rate, too late." Here's the thing. The decision to cut interest rates isn't any one person's decision to make because the Federal Reserve is an independent central bank. But what exactly does that mean? To help us break that down, the professor is in. University of Michigan economics and public policy professor Justin Wolfers joins us. Happy Friday, friend. So let's keep this plain and simple. Explain, what exactly is the Federal Reserve and why is it independent and how does it stay independent?
Great questions, Anna. So the Federal Reserve determines the country's money supply. Why does that matter to you? That means it determines interest rates. Now, our Fed is independent. What does that mean? It means that the decisions about what to do with interest rates come down to an independent board of folks who are not political hacks. They're economists and experts. They're nerds who try to figure out what's in the best interests of Americans. The alternative to an independent Fed would be to have the White House tell the Fed what to do. If that were the case, they would often be, you might think they'd be directed to make decisions that were in the president's best political interests. The danger with that is that when you're protecting the president's political interest, often you may not be serving the American people's interests. And in particular, presidents tend to do well when the economy's running hot. So they might have a tendency to run the economy too hot. If they run the economy too hot, then that's going to cause inflation. And so the problem here is that it's actually, we can go a little deeper than that, which is that it turns out inflation's a funny thing. If people believe inflation's going to be low, then they believe that their costs aren't going to rise by much, so they won't raise their prices by much. And if they don't raise their prices by much, inflation will be low, and you get a virtuous circle. Now, the great thing about that is if you have an independent central bank, people have no reason to believe anything other than inflation will be low. The problem is, if all of a sudden decision-making moved to the White House and people started to fear the president might overheat the economy, they might just start to believe that inflation was going to be high, and that alone can set off a vicious cycle. If I believe inflation is going to be high, I believe my input costs are going to rise, and therefore I feel like I'm going to have to raise my prices. And so simply the belief that there's a possibility that inflation will be high can create the reality. That's one of the most important reasons that economists say it's really, if we have an independent central bank, we can get lower inflation and it doesn't harm us in any other way.
I mean, helping us look at it from a different angle, are there any drawbacks to having an independent bank?
Yeah, so our Federal Reserve is run by a fellow by the name of Jay Powell. Jay is an independent central banker. He was originally appointed by President Trump, reappointed by President Biden, but you and I didn't go to the polling booth to vote for him. There's no sense in which there's any deep democratic legitimacy to the choices that he's making. And so we don't know that he shares our values. We can't kick him out of office if he makes bad decisions. And so on the one hand, if you have an independent central bank, you get lower inflation. On the other, people worry about the democratic legitimacy of having someone who was not elected.
So you talked about some of the risks when it comes to a central bank that is not independent. That is the case in other countries, right? Do we have an example of how this has played out in practice?
Yeah, so this is not just an economist talking about economic theory. This is the real story of real countries. And so if you think about the moment we're in the US right now, we have a populist strongman as president who really loves low interest rates. It turns out we recently had a populist strongman who really loves low interest rates come to power in another country. That country was Turkey. And there, Erdogan, things were fine for quite a while. Inflation was low and things were stable. And then Erdogan took an interest in the central bank and said he planned to take control of monetary policy. And right away, people realized this is where that vicious cycle comes in. People feared it would create high inflation, so that created high inflation. And he later went on and did what President Trump is threatening to do right now. He appointed a loyalist who believed in Erdogan not what was best for the Turkish people. That loyalist kept interest rates too low for too long, even as inflation took off. And he continued that way. And in fact, what you got in the end was inflation as high as, I think it was 86% in Turkey. That's what can happen if things go off the rails here.
Yeah, let's put that graphic back up because that is quite alarming to see how much more inflation Turkey suffered. Could what happened in Turkey happen in the U.S.? We're different countries, different governments.
You would hope the answer is no, but you fear the answer is yes. And in fact, we had a wonderful experiment earlier this week. On Wednesday, around about 11:30, there was rumours that came out that President Trump was about to fire Jay Powell, which would be the first move towards getting rid of central bank independence. And what you see in this chart is immediately stocks fell. How much did they fall? It turns out for the average viewer watching right now, your portfolio, and it might be your 401k or something else, in fact fell by about $1,000 between 11 o'clock and 11:30 last Wednesday. Very quickly, Trump heard what the markets were saying and denied that he was ever going to fire Jay Powell, and you got that $1,000 back. But for that half hour there, we saw what would happen if we took even just one small step towards getting rid of central bank independence. And if the president were to take a much larger step, the financial implications would be much, much larger and would really risk very high inflation and also risk each of our portfolios and retirement savings.
Professor Justin Wolfers, always enlightening. Thank you so much. And happy
pleasure.
Friday.